41 lawyers packed the glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of Harlan Dutton, the most expensive transactional law firm in Austin, Texas. They had their tailored suits and their leather portfolios and their degrees from Ivy League schools framed in oak back in their corner offices. They had $900 an hour billing rates and clients who paid without blinking. Then the door at the back opened and a man in gray coveralls walked in pushing a wheeled mop bucket. The laughter started quietly, the way it always does. One snicker from the associate near the window, then a ripple across the room. Not cruel yet, just reflex. The kind of laughter that says wrong door, wrong floor, wrong life. The man in the coveralls didn't look up. He parked the bucket against the far wall, pulled out a cloth, and began wiping down the credenza in long, unhurried strokes. He was enormous, 6'4" at least, shoulders that filled the fabric from seam to seam. Sun-darkened forearms, the kind of hands that had done real work long before they ever signed anything. He hadn't shaved in 4 days. His name was Chris. The name tag on his chest said so, nothing else, just Chris. Nobody in that room knew yet that 3 weeks earlier he had quietly identified the exact clause in their lead contract that would, by the end of this week, either save or collapse a $2, $3 billion deal. Nobody knew he had already written the solution. Nobody knew that the green binder sitting on a shelf on the 29th floor contained 47 pages that their entire legal team had missed across 11 months of negotiation. But here is what you need to understand before any of that. This story doesn't start with the reveal. It starts with a Tuesday morning, a mop bucket, and a man who understood that the most honest view of a room always belongs to the person everyone assumes isn't really there. He had taken the facilities job on a Monday, telling the building manager he was between things and needed steady hours. The manager, a practical woman named Donna Reeves who had seen stranger applications, asked if he had experience with commercial cleaning. He said he did. She gave him a schedule and a key card and didn't ask anything else. Harlan Dutton occupied 4 floors of the Meridian Tower, a 47-story glass tower in downtown Austin with a private lobby, a members-only restaurant on the 44th floor, and a view that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. Floors 29 through 32 belonged to the firm. 41 practicing attorneys, 12 paralegals, 19 administrative staff, and now 1 facilities contractor who arrived at 6:07 every morning and was always the last to leave. 3 weeks in, the staff had sorted him into the wallpaper. He refilled the coffee station before anyone arrived. He replaced the paper towels before they ran out. He fixed at the break room sink on a Wednesday at 7 a.m. without telling anyone it was broken, because he had noticed the water pooling under the cabinet 2 nights before. The paralegal on the 29th floor, a young woman named Jess Calloway, 26 years old, 8 months at the firm, still eating lunch at her desk because she hadn't figured out where she fit, was the only one who ever said thank you. She said it the second morning when she came in to find the first pot already brewed, and she kept saying it after that. Small words, consistently meant. Chris always nodded, not dismissively, more like acknowledged, received, understood. On a Thursday night in her 3rd week, Jess was walking back from the copy room at 11:14 p.m. She was still 2 hours from finishing a brief she needed on Harlan's desk by 7 a.m. when she noticed the light on inside the main conference room. Through the glass wall, she saw Chris standing at the long table, one hand flat on the surface, reading a document that had been left out by the afternoon team. Not skimming, reading. His eyes moved deliberately across the page. He stopped at one line. He stayed there. He turned the page. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer than she should have. Then she picked up her stack of files and walked back to her desk. She thought about it again on the drive home, again in the morning. She decided she wasn't going to say anything because she didn't know what she was seeing, and in a firm like this one, not knowing something was always safer than pretending you did. But she filed it away, the way careful people file things away, just in case. The deal was called the Meridian Basin Project, $2.3 billion in cross-border energy infrastructure, connecting a consortium of American development firms to a network of regional contracts in the Gulf. The lead client was Stetson Capital, a private equity group out of Dallas that had been a Harlan Dutton client for 17 years. The opposing party was a Dubai-based holding company called Al Rashad Commercial. 11 months of negotiation. 2 full stalls. One near collapse in September when the asset valuation methodology fell apart. And now, in what Jeffrey Harlan called the critical final window, they were down to the last round of sessions before the deal either closed or died permanently. Jeffrey Harlan was 62, senior managing partner, white-haired, broad-faced, the kind of man who wore his authority the way other men wore expensive cologne. You noticed it before you noticed anything else. He had built the firm across 30 years from a 3-person real estate practice into one of the 50 most profitable transactional firms in the country. He had done it through genuine intelligence and genuine relentlessness, and he had earned most of what he had. He was also, by the measurement of everyone below him, a man who believed entirely in hierarchy, not just professionally, existentially. He believed the world divided cleanly into people who mattered and people who moved furniture. He had never examined this belief closely enough to question it. His enforcer was Craig Dutton, 45, junior partner, office director in function if not in title. Craig managed upward brilliantly and managed downward without mercy. The particular talent that gets a certain kind of person into every important room and respected by no one once the door closes. He had been with the firm 9 years. He knew where every pressure point was. On the morning of the final negotiation session, Craig walked the 32nd floor 20 minutes before the Al-Rashid team arrived. He stopped at the glass conference room. He saw Chris wiping the long table with a microfiber cloth, working in careful circles. He looked at him the way people look at objects placed inconveniently. "Get that out of here," Craig said, meaning the bucket, meaning the cloth, meaning the man holding it. "Clients in 20 minutes. Chris looked up. He had the particular stillness of someone who has heard that tone enough times to have made a complete peace with it. He picked up the bucket and moved toward the door. Craig watched him go. Then, because a junior associate named Tyler Webb was standing nearby, and Craig always needed someone nearby to perform for, he said loudly enough to carry, "Last time we let cleaning staff in here unsupervised, we found handprints on the presentation glass. Make sure the window end is wiped down before you leave." Tyler pretended not to smile. Chris was already in the hallway, back-turned bucket wheels fading down the corridor. He didn't say anything. He kept moving. And Craig stood in the doorway a moment longer with his chest out, satisfied in the way that small people are satisfied when they can make a large person shrink, not understanding, not even slightly, what he had just stood next to. The Al-Rashid delegation arrived at 9:47 a.m., 6 people. Lead counsel Nadia Al-Qasim, late 30s, Georgetown trained, a decade of practice in London before returning to the region, the kind of lawyer who asked every question exactly once and remembered every answer forever. 2 senior associates, a financial analyst named Marcus Okafor, who had flown in from Zurich specifically for this session, and 2 men whose function was presence, the broad-shouldered quiet that signals someone important is paying very close attention. Harlan and Dutton's side was larger. 8 attorneys, 3 financial advisors, and a court reporter named Helen, who typed fast enough that her fingers were a blur against the keys. Harlan sat at the head of the long table. He liked sitting at the head of things. He opened by thanking the Al-Rashid team for their patience during the revision period, used the word constructive 4 times in the first 3 minutes, and passed the floor to his lead transaction partner, a man named Douglas Park, 40, technically precise, good at the mechanical parts of deals, and not fully aware yet that this particular deal had broken down and for reasons that were not mechanical. The morning went badly. By 11 a.m., they were deep into a dispute about Article 14, the force majeure clause, and Nadia Al-Qasim had twice asked Douglas to clarify the intent behind subclause 14C and received answers that clarified nothing. The third time she asked, she set her pen down on the polished table with a small, quiet click that everyone in the room registered. "That clause," she said carefully, "creates an obligation on the American consortium that our principals understand differently than your principals. Until we resolve the interpretive gap, we cannot move forward on anything else." Douglas said the firm's reading was consistent with industry standard practice. Nadia said the firm's reading was consistent with how the clause would be read in a domestic context. This was a cross-border agreement. The interpretive framework changed. Douglas said he would have to disagree with that characterization. The temperature in the room dropped about 4 degrees. Harlan felt it. That particular cooling that happens when two sides have been talking for a long time and have stopped hearing each other. He looked at his team. He looked at 11 months of documents spread across the table. He thought about 30 years of reputation and $2, $3 billion, and the Stetson Capital relationship that had kept this firm solvent through 2 recessions. At 11:26 a.m., there was a knock at the glass wall. Jess Calloway stood in the doorway with a carafe of coffee. She was not supposed to be there. Coffee was handled by the catering service, but she had been watching the negotiation through the glass since 10 o'clock that morning, and she had made a decision, the quiet, fast kind she made when she saw something that couldn't wait. She looked at Jeffrey Harlan. She said she was sorry to interrupt and just wanted to make sure the room had what it needed. She set the carafe down. Then, very carefully, she said there was something in the facility storage room on 29 he might want to look at. Third shelf, a green binder. She thought it might be relevant. She left before anyone could ask her anything. Harlan sent Craig downstairs more out of exhaustion than genuine expectation. He called a 15-minute recess, apologized briefly to the Al-Rashid team, and stepped into the hallway. Craig came back 4 minutes later with a green 3-ring binder, no label on the spine. He set it on the table in front of Harlan and stepped back with the particular body language of a man who already knows what he thinks. Probably nothing, Craig said. Cleaning staff leave things everywhere. Could be someone's MBA coursework. Could be something they printed off the internet. He crossed his arms. I wouldn't waste the recess on it. Harlan picked it up, flipped it open. The first page was dense. Margin notes crowding the printed text, cross-references, a hand-drawn diagram of overlapping legal jurisdictions in the upper right corner. He turned to the second page, then the third. Craig checked his watch. Jeffrey, the Al-Rashid team is going to read this as stalling. We should go back in and push through 14S as written. Douglas can reframe. Harlan turned to page 31, one paragraph, underlined in a single deliberate stroke, and beside it, in that same compact handwriting, this is the door. He read it once. He read it again. He set the binder down on the table and was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a man who has just understood something he should have understood 3 months ago. He looked at Craig. He said, "Where did this come from?" Craig said the paralegal said the storage room on 29. Harlan walked out and down the stairs himself. This was not something he typically did. In the small storage area between the copy room and the filing alcove on 29, Chris was working his way through a collapsed shelving unit with a screwdriver, replacing the wall anchors one by one. He did not look up when the door opened. He finished the anchor he was setting, then set the screwdriver down on the shelf beside him. Harlan said, "Did you write that binder?" Chris said, "Yes." The silence lasted long enough to hear the building's ventilation cycling. Harlan said, "Where does that analysis come from?" Chris said, 12 years in cross-border infrastructure transactions. Gulf side counterparties primarily. I've seen the interpretive gap in 14 SAS before. Different contract, same architecture," Harlan said. "You've seen it before," Chris said. The domestic versus GCC definitional split in force majeure language, it comes up in about 1 in 3 cross-border energy deals and gets missed in about 2 of those 3. Your team wasn't careless. They were close to it for too long. Harlan stood very still for a moment. He said, "Tell me about the door." Page 31. Chris stood up. He was 3 inches taller than Harlan, which Harlan registered and could not do anything about. He said, "There's a 2019 arbitration ruling out of the DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Center, that resolved almost exactly this issue in a Gulfside energy contract. The panel created a dual jurisdiction interpretive framework. Both parties read their version of the clause into the same binding structure. Nobody concedes anything. You're just changing the language," Harlan said. "How do you know about DIFC arbitration rulings from 2019? Chris said, "I was in the room for one of them." There was another silence. Harlan looked at the man in front of him, the coveralls, the 4-day beard, the hands that had been cleaning his firm's floors for 3 weeks, and felt something shift inside his understanding of the morning, of the month, of perhaps the last several years. He said, "Who are you?" And here is where you need to know something that Chris had not told anyone at Harlan and Dutton. His full name was Christopher Donovan Hemsworth. His father, Robert Hemsworth, had built a mid-sized infrastructure advisory firm in the late 1980s out of a single contract and a lot of stubbornness. In the spring of 2004, Chris was 20 years old, studying finance at a state school on partial scholarship because his family did not have the money for anywhere else. His father took him to observe a deal signing in Houston. Nothing glamorous. A regional energy corridor, maybe $40 million total. But afterward, his father had sat with him in a hotel lobby and walked him through every clause in the agreement, line by line, explaining not what the language said but why it said it that way, and what would happen if the wrong people read it differently later. His father had said, "The most expensive thing in any deal is not the price. It's the word that means two different things to two different people, and nobody catches it until court has to." That conversation had lasted 3 hours. It had cost Robert Hemsworth nothing except time. It had cost Chris nothing except attention. He still had the notepad from that lobby session, spiral-bound, half the pages filled with his 20-year-old handwriting. He kept it in a drawer at the house in Byron Bay. Not as a trophy, as a reminder that the most important things he had ever learned had come from someone who took him seriously before he had given anyone a reason to. He had run the Hemsworth Group's infrastructure division for 8 years. Cross-border energy, primarily. Gulf counterparties, Southeast Asian consortiums, Pacific Rim logistics corridors. He had sat on the 32nd floor of buildings like this one, had sat at tables like the one upstairs, had been in all the ways this world measures such things, exactly the kind of person Jeffrey Harlan considered worth listening to. He had left 2 years ago, not because of failure, because he had watched, across the years, what happened to deals when the people closest to them stopped being able to see them clearly, when proximity became blindness, when status became the filter through which everything got read. He had needed to understand the Meridian Basin project from outside. He had needed to understand whether Harlan and Dutton had what the project required. The only way to understand a room honestly was to be in it as someone everyone ignored. He still had the scar on his right hand from a rigging accident on a construction site in Queensland in 2011, a cable that snapped on a morning he had been on site to observe a structural assessment. The site foreman, a man named Gareth Cole, had pulled him clear before it got worse. Gareth had not known who Chris was. He had just pulled him clear. Chris had not forgotten that. Harlan listened to all of this without interrupting. When Chris finished, there was a pause. Then Harlan said, "You took a facilities job in my building to audit a deal you have an indirect stake in." Chris said, "A subsidiary holds a position in the Stetson Capital Consortium. It's disclosed in their investor schedule. Your team would have found it if they'd looked at the full cap table." Harlan said, "You should have come through the front door." Chris said, "I know." He paused. "The front door tells you what people want you to see. The back door tells you what's actually there." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need you upstairs." He did not change out of the coveralls. They came up the stairwell rather than the elevator. Harlan's choice, no explanation given. When they pushed through the door onto the 32nd floor, Craig Dutton was standing in the hallway outside the conference room, phone in hand, waiting. Tyler Webb was 3 feet behind him, pretending to review something on a tablet. Craig looked at Chris, he looked at Harlan. Something moved across his face. Not quite understanding yet, but the first warning signal of it. "Jeffrey." He kept his voice level. "The recess has been 12 minutes. We need to get back in," Harlan said. "We will," he gestured toward Chris. "This is Christopher Hemsworth. He'll be joining the session." Craig's eyes stayed on the coveralls for a beat too long. He said quietly, so only Harlan could hear. "You cannot be serious," Harlan said. "Craig." He ran the infrastructure division of the Hemsworth Group for 8 years. He has a disclosed position in the Stetson Capital Consortium. And he just explained, in approximately 4 minutes, what your team has been unable to explain in 11 months. He paused. "We're going in." He walked past Craig without waiting for a response. Chris followed. Tyler Webb, who had heard every word and was no longer pretending to look at his tablet, stepped back against the wall to let them through. Craig stood in the hallway alone for a moment, the phone still in his hand, watching the conference room door close behind them. The thing that had happened in front of a witness. He could not unknow it. He could not rearrange it into something less damaging. The power he had spent 9 years carefully building, the kind that works only as long as everyone agrees to pretend it's there, had just been weighed against something real, and the result was not close. He put his phone in his pocket and went back into the room. Nadia Al-Qasim looked up. Her eyes moved from Harlan to the man beside him. She was a careful reader of rooms. She did not show what she was thinking, but something in her posture shifted. The recalibration of a person who has just recognized that the variables have changed. Harlan said he wanted to introduce someone who had been working with the firm in a consulting capacity. He used the word consulting carefully. Precisely, he said. Chris. And Chris sat down at the table. He pulled a legal pad from the table, uncapped a pen, and said, in a voice that was flat and quiet and carried the particular authority of someone who had said important things in important rooms for a very long time. Article 14, Subclause C. You're reading from different definitional baselines. I think we can fix that in about 20 minutes. Nadia Al-Qasim looked at him for one long moment. Then she said, go ahead. What followed was 71 minutes that nobody in the room described accurately afterward, partly because the technical content was genuinely complex, and partly because something else was happening underneath it that resisted simple description. Chris walked through the interpretive gap in 14D without notes, citing the 2019 DIFC ruling from memory, docket number, name of the presiding arbitrator, the specific paragraph of the panel's reasoning. He explained the dual jurisdiction framework clearly enough for both financial teams and precisely enough for both legal teams. He anticipated 3 objections before they were raised. He answered each one before the person raising it had finished forming the sentence. Marcus Okafor, the analyst from Zurich, leaned forward at the 30-minute mark. He said the Q2 operational projection Harlan and Dutton's team had sent in September had underlying assumptions that didn't account for regulatory lag in the Eastern Corridor. Chris said he knew. He said the original modeling used a 6-week average, but the actual approval timeline in that jurisdiction ran closer to 11. He said the September projection was wrong. He wrote the corrected figure on the legal pad and slid it across the table. Okafor looked at it. He checked his laptop model. He said quietly, yes, that's right. On the Harlan and Dutton side of the table, Douglas Park had stopped trying to lead and was writing down everything Chris said with the intensity of a student who had just realized he had missed the entire semester. Jess Calloway, who had been brought in as note-taker when the session resumed, was typing faster than the court reporter. At the 60-minute mark, Nadia Al-Qasim raised the question she had clearly been building toward all morning. The indemnification cascade in Article 19, a secondary trigger their principals believed created disproportionate exposure on their side in a regulatory default scenario. Chris said, that trigger was added in the August revision. Nadia said, yes. Chris said, it shouldn't be there. The room went still, he said. The original framework didn't include a secondary trigger in 19. It was added during the August round by our side without adequate coordination with the overall risk architecture. It creates exactly the asymmetry you're identifying. He looked down the table at Douglas Park. He said, it should be removed. Douglas looked like a man standing in a river who had just understood the current. Chris looked back at Nadia. He said, I'm sorry it got that far. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Nadia Al-Qasim did something that 11 months of negotiation had not produced. She smiled, briefly, professionally, but genuinely, and said, that's what we needed to hear. They broke at 1:15 p.m. The deal wasn't done. 14 points remained, but it was alive in a way it had not been at 9 that morning, and everyone on both sides of the table understood why. In the hallway outside the penthouse conference room, Craig Dutton pulled Harlan aside. His face carried the urgent energy of a man who needed to reestablish the natural order before it slipped further. He said, Jeffrey, I understand today has been unusual, but the precedent this sets, bringing someone in from facilities without vetting, without conflict clearance, the liability exposure alone, Harlan said. He resolved the 14's issue in 20 minutes. Craig said, that's not the point. Harlan said, he identified a drafting error in 19 that your team missed for 3 months. Craig said, I don't know who this person actually is. We know nothing about him. He applied for a cleaning contract. He has been mopping our floors. Harlan said, has there been a single complaint about his work? Craig opened his mouth. He closed it. There had not been. 0 complaints in 3 weeks. 2 unsolicited compliments from senior partners who had emailed what they thought was a general facilities inbox. Harlan said, "I suggest you use the afternoon break to read Articles 17 through 22, because when we go back in at 2:30, I need someone who has actually read them." He walked back toward the conference room. Craig stood in the hallway and felt the particular vertigo of a person whose hierarchy has just been redrawn without their consent. That evening, after the afternoon session closed with 10 of the remaining 14 points resolved, Jeffrey Harlan sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor with the door closed and made 3 phone calls. The first was to the managing partner at a firm in Houston that Craig had previously worked for. The call lasted 11 minutes. Harlan did not say much. He mostly listened. What he heard was this. In the spring of 2019, Craig Dutton had been the supervising partner on a mid-size acquisition at that firm. A paralegal named Denise Farrow, 4 years at the firm, third-year law school at night, had flagged an error in the asset transfer schedule 3 days before closing. Craig had told her the error was within acceptable variance and to let it go. She had sent a follow-up memo anyway. Craig had marked her performance review that quarter as unsatisfactory and denied her advancement petition. Denise Farrow had left the firm 2 months later. The acquisition had closed. The error she flagged had surfaced 14 months later in a regulatory audit and cost the client $1 million in corrective filings. The second call was to the Harlan and Dutton head of HR, a woman named Rachel Pruitt. Harlan asked her to pull Craig's complete performance file, every 360-degree review, every associate complaint, everything going back to his first year. He asked her to have it on his desk by 8 a.m. The third call was to a former Hemsworth Group contact in Sydney. The call lasted 4 minutes. At the end of it, Harlan sat for a moment with the phone still in his hand, looking out at the Austin skyline. The towers lit up against the evening sky, the highway below moving with the steady pulse of the city, and understood fully, for the first time, what had been sitting in his building for 3 weeks. The deal closed on a Thursday, 18 days later. The $3 billion agreement was executed in the firm's private signing room on the 32nd floor, a room with floor-to-ceiling glass, a single long oak table, and a view of downtown Austin that clients paid indirectly to sit in front of. Both legal teams signed. Both financial teams signed. Nadia Al-Qasim shook hands with Douglas Park, who had, across the final 2 weeks, quietly and completely rebuilt his approach to the cross-border sections of the document. Nobody held a press conference about Article 14 or the Green Binder or the dual jurisdiction framework that had unlocked 11 months of deadlock. These things don't typically make the news. But 2 days after the signing, Harlan called Craig into his office at 3:45 p.m. The conversation lasted 38 minutes. Jess Calloway, whose desk was 12 feet from the closed door, could not hear specific words. But she could hear the shape of the conversation with complete clarity. Long silences. One sustained period where Harlan's voice was flat and continuous, and nothing came back from the other side. Then the sound of a chair. Craig Dutton left the building at 4:23 p.m. carrying a cardboard box. He had been with the firm 9 years. His departure letter, drafted that morning under Section 11. 4 of the partnership agreement, conduct materially inconsistent with firm values, effective immediately, was filed with HR at 4:31 p.m. His access cards were deactivated at 4:32 p.m. The following week, Rachel Pruitt's HR review produced a documented pattern across 9 years. 4 associate complaints about professional conduct, 2 of which had been filed and then quietly withdrawn after conversations with Craig. 3 performance reviews of junior staff that colleagues described as retaliatory, and a 2021 incident in which a first-year paralegal named Marcus Webb had reported being told in front of 2 witnesses that people in his position should not have opinions about people in Craig's position. All 4 former associates were contacted. All 4 agreed to provide formal statements within 48 hours of being reached. For years they had stayed quiet. Craig had still been in the building, still controlling performance reviews, still deciding who moved forward and who didn't. The risk of speaking had been real, and the protection had been zero. When he was no longer there, they picked up the phone. The statements went into Craig's file. The file went to the firm's ethics committee. The Ethics Committee referred the matter to the Texas State Bar's Professional Conduct Division on the 3rd of the following month. The inquiry was opened under Disciplinary Rule 8. 4DE, conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. It would take 14 months to resolve. Craig's severance was $0. The partnership agreement's conduct clause was specific on this point. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before starting the engine. Whatever he thought about in those 11 minutes, no one could say. What he told his wife when he got home was something she would remember for years afterward. He said, "I looked at people wrong for a long time." He said it quietly, without anger or self-pity, just the flat accounting of a man who had finally added something up correctly. 6 weeks later, he sent a handwritten note to Jess Calloway, 3 sentences. It said, "I should have done more to support your work here. I made assumptions about who mattered in that building that I had no right to make. I'm sorry." It took him 4 days to write those 3 sentences, and he sent them without expectation of a reply. Jess read the note twice. She kept it in her desk drawer, not because she needed the apology, but because it was the first time in 8 months at the firm that someone above her in the hierarchy had written something real. Jeffrey Harlan did not escape the accounting entirely. 3 weeks after the closing, the Austin Business Chronicle ran a piece on the Meridian Basin deal, routine coverage, deal value, parties involved, timeline. A reporter named Sandra Oaks called Harlan for a quote. He gave her one. Then, at the end of the call, Sandra asked, "We understand the key interpretive breakthrough in the final sessions came from someone outside the firm's legal team. Can you tell us about that?" Harlan was quiet for 3 seconds. He said, "It came from someone who had spent 3 weeks in this building in a position that nobody, including me, had looked at carefully enough." He paused. "That's the part of the story I think about most." The quote ran the following Thursday. It was not the detail Sandra Oaks had been fishing for, but it was the most honest thing the paper printed that week. Jess Calloway was promoted 2 months after the closing. Transaction coordinator. Salary increase of $31,000. She had not asked for either. Harlan had watched the way she had moved through that week. The quiet observation, the decision to go downstairs with the coffee carafe, the precise economy of telling him exactly enough and nothing more. And he had understood that the person who sees clearly and acts with courage is exactly the kind of person a firm lives or dies on. She still made the first pot of coffee in the morning, but now she did it because she wanted to. On Chris's 3rd visit to the building, consulting arrangements, different clothes each time, still quiet, still nothing that announced itself. Jess met him in the elevator on the way up to 29. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes," she said, "the binder. Were you always going to put it there? Or were you waiting to see if someone would find it?" He thought about it for a moment. He said, "Both. I needed to know if there was someone in this building worth working with." She said, "That's a strange way to find out." He said, "I've learned more from watching people in ordinary situations than from watching them in important ones." He looked at the elevator doors. "You said thank you the second morning for the coffee." She said, "Of course." He said, "You'd be surprised how rare that is." The elevator reached 29. She stepped out. The doors closed. She stood in the corridor for a moment, thinking about ordinary situations and what they reveal about a person and about a man who had come in through the back door of one of the most powerful law firms in Texas. Not because he lacked credentials to walk through the front, but because he understood something that most people with credentials spend their whole lives missing. The world is not divided into people who matter and people who move furniture. It never was. The Meridian Basin Project created $3 billion in cross-border energy infrastructure across 4 regional corridors, 700 construction jobs in the first phase, 1,200 downstream operational roles over the life of the agreement, a clean energy distribution network projected to run for 40 years. Nobody wrote a headline about Article 14, Subclause C. Nobody published a feature on the dual jurisdiction framework or the 2019 DIFC ruling or the 47 pages in a green binder on the 3rd shelf of a storage room on the 29th floor of a tower in downtown Austin. These things don't make the news. But they are the news, the real version, the version that actually happened. Jeffrey Harlan stood at his office window, On the morning the announcement published, looking out at the city, and he thought about something Chris had said in the break room at noon, on the day the deal nearly died. He had said, "The front door tells you what people want you to see. The back door tells you what's actually there." Harlan had been practicing law for 38 years. He had sat in hundreds of rooms like the one upstairs and believed genuinely that he understood them. What he understood now, standing at the window watching the city move below, was that he had been reading rooms the way powerful people read rooms, from the center, which is the one angle from which you see the least. There is a kind of intelligence that cannot be purchased with a billing rate or a title or a degree in an oak frame. It doesn't arrive through the front door because it doesn't need to. It moves through the building quietly. It notices the water under the cabinet. It fixes the shelf. It reads the document left out on the long table at 11 p.m. and writes 47 pages of analysis nobody asked for, and puts them on a shelf and waits to see if anyone is paying enough attention to find them. The man in the gray coveralls had that intelligence. He always had. Think about the last time you walked past someone without really seeing them. The person who refilled the coffee, the one who held the elevator door, the one who fixed the thing you didn't know was broken. Think about what you assumed about them. Think about what you never thought to ask. Brilliance does not always announce itself. It doesn't always come with the title or the tailored suit or the corner office view. Sometimes it comes in through the back, watches for 3 weeks, finds the door nobody else could see, and walks through it quietly, while everyone else is still arguing about who should have the key. If this story made you think differently about who you look past, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about people who prove that dignity is not a credential, and that the most important person in the room is sometimes the one nobody thought to look at. Because every day all around you, there are people being underestimated. Make sure you're not one of the reasons why. This is a fictional dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. All supporting characters, businesses, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI-assisted.